All right, so welcome everyone to our November 2024 SG seminar titled Labor Unions in the 20th and the 21st Century in the United States, Policy Developments and Barriers to Organizing. My name is Breno Braga. I am an economist at the Urban Institute, and I'm also an SG board member. I'll be co-hosting the seminar today with Masa and Aaron. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. We'll take the first 5 minutes to introduce the seminar and our speaker. Our speaker, Danny, will have 50 minutes for his presentation, and we'll reserve the last 30 minutes for a Q&A session. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. For the Q&A session, you can raise your hand virtually, and then Masa will call your name. Alternatively, you can type your question or comment in the chat, and we will read out loud to the speaker. But before I start the presentation, I want to advertise our society. SGU supports the professional development of government economists and economists interested in the economics of public policy. The way we achieve this goal is through many activities throughout the year. We have the monthly seminars like the one you are attending today. We'll also have our annual conference and sponsor sessions at other conferences, which I'll describe in a second. We also have many leadership opportunities for government economists and those interested in public policy. So keep an eye out for upcoming election for new board members in April. And we also have networking and mentoring opportunities. So the first thing I want to mention is that we have 6 SG sponsor sessions in the 2025 ASSA meeting in San Francisco. I invited everyone to attend those sessions in case you're in California. And I also would like to invite everyone to submit papers to our 2025 SG annual conference, which next year will happen on April 4th at the American University, Washington College of Law. Stay tuned for the call of papers. And with that, I'll pass to Aaron to present our speaker.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin George, and I'm an economist at the Department of Labor Women's Bureau, and I'm also a board member of SGE. Our speaker today is Dr. Daneri, Assistant Professor of Political Science in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. His areas of expertise include labor politics, corporate lobbying, agricultural policy, and the growing inequality in the United States over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. He uses a broad range of methods, including archival research, machine learning, instrumental variable estimation, text analysis, and behavioral experiments. He completed his doctoral work at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and received his bachelor's degree from Oberlin College. He grew up in Miami, Florida, and is a dual citizen of the United States and Spain. Dr. Daneri?
Thanks so much, Aaron and Breno. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started here. So is that working, Breno? Great. Okay. So yeah, thank you all for coming today. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I know it's a bit of a strange day to have a lecture and to talk about anything but the election. I'll tell you, it's not easy to be a political scientist right now, and I'm sure it's not easy to be a government economist either, no matter what side of the political divide you're on. But for better or worse, I won't be talking about the election today. But I'm happy to take questions about the policy implications of the election after the talk. And this talk will be wide-ranging within the theme of labor politics. So I'll give you some historical background on unions and union policy, some of the basic rational choice frameworks we employ to understand unions. I'll talk about shifting politics at the bureaucratic level, maybe at some agencies some of you work for. And then I'll do some snapshots of selected research projects I've done on some of these topics. So slides advancing, Breno? Great. Okay, so you're probably broadly familiar with the trends in this graph. This is just some basic Bureau of Labor Statistics data I pulled on union membership over time across sectors. So this is the entire economy, all wage and salary workers. As you can see in the graph, unions reached their peak about 15 years after the major New Deal legislation that gives private sector workers a federally recognized right to organize. So that's around 1950 is sort of the heyday of labor unions in this country. Before the National Labor Relations Act in the New Deal in 1935, unions could still form. That's, the right to form a union and join a union. That's a right protected by freedom of association in the First Amendment. But before the National Labor Relations Act, essentially unions and union members didn't have a range of federally recognized rights that compelled employers to recognize their unions, bargain with them, prevent employers from firing employees on the basis of their union status. So unions preceded the New Deal, of course, but this sort of new federal structure ushers in a wave of unionization. But then, of course, the story we're all familiar with is since that heyday in the mid-century, we've been on a persistent decline. And in the last few years, we've stood around 10% of the workforce is unionized. So why join a union? I think from a rational choice perspective, it's pretty clear why one would do this. We know that, at a basic level, unions negotiate favorable contracts for their workers, right? Labor economists for decades have studied what we call the wage premium, the union wage premium. Most research, if you were to do like a meta-analysis, finds that this premium tends to be on the order of 15 to 25%. So in other words, if you take an employee in a particular industry and compare a union employee in that industry to a non-union employee, the union employee will make about 15 to 25% more on average. There's also a benefits premium flowing from the collective bargaining agreements that is well studied, ranging from healthcare to retirement. Pensions were a staple of union contracts, although pensions are sort of a disappearing feature of collective bargaining agreements, sort of hard to get a pension at the bargaining table, but nonetheless have been a feature for a lot of union members' contracts. And then, of course, you get a range of other benefits, maybe most notably legal representation in the case of a range of possible civil disputes that might occur in the workplace. So, I'm talking to a group of economists here, so you'll be, broadly familiar with collective action problems and free riding. This is a particularly sticky problem with unions, sort of inherent to the process of forming a union and sustaining it. The collective action problems arise from the notion of union security clause. So a major feature of the founding sort of union regulatory framework, the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, is that unions can compel people who are in the workplace to pay dues, even if they are not union members per se. So we call that a closed shop. The logic being that, if you're a worker in a steel plant and you don't want to be a part of the union, but there is a union in the plant that has negotiated a contract, you still benefit from that collective bargaining agreement, and so you should be compelled to put some skin in the game and contribute. So it's a statutory mechanism of just eliminating free riding, right? So you overcome the collective action problem by just compelling people to join. So there is no voluntary, defection in classical terms. So workers must pay dues, right, in a unionized private sector shop. Now, Taft-Hartley in 1947, an act of Congress, allows states to change this by passing right-to-work laws. So it doesn't upend the closed shop federally. It gives states a mechanism to do this. Now, here's a map of the roughly half of the states, more than half now, that are right-to-work states. So this generates a classic collective action problem, because these laws allow for an open shop. In other words, they allow people to be in a unionized workplace but not pay dues. And we know, just from both theory and research, that a lot of people will free ride if given the opportunity to do so. So this map shows all the states that are right to work. Some, triggered constitutionally, so they had a right to work statute preceding Taft-Hartley that just took effect right away. Others have passed right to work laws through their state legislatures. There's a lot of research going back, maybe most famously to Elwood and Fine in '87, that's showing that right to work lowers unionization. Again, the mechanism just being the free rider effect. It starves unions of dues and resources, so it hurts their ability to organize, establish an organizing presence in the state. I think the most recent event studies by labor economists on this finds that in absolute terms, unionization decreases about 4% after at least after 5 years of a right to work law being in effect. So that's in other words, if you were if your unionization rate in your state was 10%, it would be 6% after right to work, which might not sound like a lot, but it's a lot. Okay, so I'm talking to a group of public sector workers. You guys probably know a lot about this already, but public sector unions at federal, state, and local levels have generally had closed shops throughout history. Unions really take off in the public sector when JFK recognizes their right to organize through executive order. So different mechanism than the National Labor Relations Act, which was a heavily debated act of Congress. But of course, there's considerable variation in what the Union Security Clause, the thing that compels people to pay dues, it looks like across states before 2018. So you have, mostly closed shops, but some states and some municipalities allow people to, for instance, pay, if they're not a member of the union, pay a smaller due than full members. So you have a range of sort of versions of union security clauses before 2018. But as you may know, since the Supreme Court decision in 2018, the closed shop is banned for public sector workers on First Amendment ground. The logic that being that you can't compel someone to associate with a union. But we're still, it's still hard to measure the impact of this because it's pretty early. But we have some data suggesting that free riding is happening. It hasn't completely destroyed unions at federal, state, and local levels. But for instance, New York State employees experienced a reduction in due payers by of 21% between 2017 and 2022. So 226,000 down to 178,000. So people are free riding. Will that, be the death knell for public sector unions? Seems like not completely, but there's cause for concern if you're pro-union in the public sector. But then while we're on the topic of public sector, I want to sort of return to that graph I generated earlier of the basic union membership graph, and just sort of add public sector to the graph. So while overall unionization has been in a relatively steep decline for half a century, since the 60s, since that JFK order, the public sector has been a bright spot in unionization. So public sector unionization shot up in the 60s and 70s and remains quite high. Of course, they're a smaller share of they're a relatively small share of the workforce, so it's not going to completely change the overall trend, but it should be noted. So I'm going to back up chronologically a little bit and talk about labor's struggle for representation in government, because there's a lot of interesting history here. Labor's struggle to get a cabinet level agency, the department, which we have now in the Department of Labor in some sense, goes back to at least the Civil War. So William Silvis, for instance, who was the founder of the National Labor Union in the 19th century, was very vocal in his view that while existing government departments like the Department of Interior at the time and the Department of the Treasury, which had deep connections to industries such as banking and railroads, he was vocal in his view that while they were active in promoting free enterprise and capital accumulation among the industrial elite, labor didn't have anything represent workers in those sectors, right? So, but the going is rough on this, and labor groups don't make much headway beyond getting a standing committee in the House. So, Silvis was famous at the time for this quote, no department had as its sole object the care and protection of the labor. Again, we have a Department of Treasury, we have Department of Interior, but nothing on the side of labor. The first concession is this standing committee in the House in 1867. That didn't completely appease labor, but it's certainly something. So labor takes a new strategy, though, which I think academics would be too partial to in the late 19th century. And they say, okay, we can't get cabinet level representation, so let's at least get some data on what's going on. And this generates a lot of jobs for early economists, actually. And they start creating these state bureaus of labor statistics. And these are, you can see these like as sort of one of the earliest developments in sort of the career paths that you all have chosen. You get these state bureaus of labor statistics. The first one is in Massachusetts in 1869, and it quickly becomes embroiled in a partisan battle over its impartiality. So the first people to head it saw themselves as a voice for labor. So the reports they produce and the questions they ask were very much favorable to the workers' cause. With some pushing and pulling, this Massachusetts Bureau in 1869 ends up being, by the accounts I can recover from the historical record, I think pretty impartial, as government economists tend to be. And 12 other states follow suit and create these state bureaus of labor statistics. Now, a little later, labor sort of emerges from the panic of 1873 pretty weak. And in a meeting of influential labor leaders in 74, I believe, they explicitly decide to put aside attempts to get a national department of labor. And in 10 years or so later, in 1884, both parties are courting labor's vote, and they advocate for some sort of department. They end up getting this building, which is called the Bureau of Labor. So it's not cabinet level. It was just sort of a national version of these state labor statistic departments I've talked about. So they enforced no laws, they created no rules, they just did research, which is really important, but it's not quite the same as what labor wanted, which was a cabinet level representation. Now, eventually they get a non-cabinet department in 1888, a few years later. It has some additional functions. W.E.B. Du Bois, pictured in this slide, famously worked for this department, producing some very influential early studies on in labor economics and Black, particularly studies on Black households. So I would say the next sort of juncture is this Department of Commerce and Labor. This is an interesting historical anecdote, but basically during President Cleveland's tenure, the Knights of Labor, who had a lot of access to the White House at the time, headed by Terence Powderly, presented a memorandum on the scope of a new department, which, in addition to this sort of statistical role that the Bureau of Labor had, would sort of conciliate labor disputes and sponsor an employment service to direct workmen from where they crowd each other idle to where they may help each other work. But instead of creating a Department of Labor, to the dismay of labor leaders at the time, they created this sort of joint Department of Commerce and Labor. And as the secretary of the AFL said at the time, labor sort of viewed its functions as fundamentally contradictory. So Morrison, the head of the AFL, said it was sort of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You can't both represent labor and employers in a single department. And so this doesn't satisfy the labor movement. And so labor quickly mobilizes to get its own department. So how do we get to the Department of Labor? Should I take questions? I'm happy to take questions during the.
I think we should hold the questions until the Q&A session.
Okay.
So Mel, let's hold on your question until then.
Sure. Yeah, Mel, just write it down, and I'm happy to take it later on. Okay. So how do we get to the Department of Labor? Well, the story goes, in 1910, the Democrats won control of the House, and 15 union members were actually elected to Congress. We don't see that very much anymore. Congressman William B. Wilson, who was formerly an officer of the United Mine Workers, became chairman of the House Committee on Labor, for instance, and he championed creating an independent department. There was another representative from New York, William Sulzer, who introduced a Department of Labor bill in 1912, which passed this now very labor favorable House in 1912 with little opposition. And then Taft, the president at the time, although a Republican, he was opposed to the idea, but he reluctantly signed it given the political pressure from labor. So in the Senate, Senator Borah, a Republican of Idaho, had moderately pro-union views. He appears to have pushed this through the Republican Senate without a record of the vote. So I can't, we haven't, it was, which means in political science terms, they were trying to sort of obscure the vote from their constituents by holding a voice vote instead of a roll call vote. So you won't be able to find evidence of this vote. Sorry, I've sort of advanced a little too quickly. Okay, but before I go to the next slide, I want to just say it's hard to overstate how bad labor conditions were in the late 19th century and early 20th century of the United States. Remember, there's no minimum wage. There's no 8-hour day because there's no federal standards governing overtime, with the exception of the railroad industry, which had some federal laws governing working hours. Child labor is ubiquitous, right? Even in the most perilous industries, like mining, we have children working in mines across the country. Arbitrary wage theft is rampant. Women and people of color, in particular, labor under horrible conditions, usually for far less than the prevailing wage in their industry. There's no law governing unions, so union busting is rampant. You can fire someone for starting a union because there's no right to federally recognized right to form and be part of a union, other than basic First Amendment freedom of association. But you know, I know this like sounds like a lot, but I'm gonna argue that even though we get a lot of progress in these new departments, they don't actually do that much relative to the scale of the problems and constantly evolving nature of work in American political economy. But suffice it to say, we're in a state of a largely unregulated economy at this point, and so the Department of Labor is something was something of a huge win for labor at the time. Okay. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson's pick to head this new Department of Labor is Secretary William B. Wilson. And one early milestone in this newly minted DOL is the passage of the Federal Employees Compensation Act program, which provides benefits to federal employees who have sustained work-related injuries or illnesses. It's administered by the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs, and it covers approximately 2.7 million laborers. So it's the largest self-insured workers' compensation in the world at the time. The original version of the bill was actually written and introduced by William B. Wilson about 8 years before, when he was representative for Pennsylvania in the House of Representatives. And I think it's important to note he was, a little bit about his biography is an interesting character. So he was born in 1862, and when he was 9 years old, he went to work in the coal mines in north central Pennsylvania, and he continued to work in the mines for nearly 2 decades. And by the time he was 26 or 27, he became president of his local union. And by 1900, he had worked his way up the union leadership ladder and was named secretary treasurer of the United Mine Workers, which still exists today. And he would stay there in that position until 1908, when he was elected to Congress. So this was a man quite obviously with deep ties to the union movement. It's hard to imagine what a Department of Labor would have done without figures like this. So another important figure is Julia Lathrop. She was the first woman to head a statutory federal bureau of any kind at the appointment of the president with consent of the Senate. So before her appointment, she was active in several reform movements relating to women's and children's rights. She lectured at the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, which later became part of the University of Chicago. And she campaigned fiercely for another sort of landmark bill, the Keatings-Owen Act of 1916, which forbade the selling of goods across state lines which were produced by child labor. It's later declared unconstitutional, but this is like a sort of a landmark in the fight to end child labor in the United States. Lathrop is succeeded by Grace Abbott, who was an early union organizer for a garment workers union called the Women's Trade Union League. She was highly educated. She got a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 1905. She was on the faculty there. She was a director of an institute called the Immigrants Protective League, which she founded. She was very active in promoting policies to limit the exploitation of immigrants. And I would say her dedication to advocating for the interests of workers and ordinary citizens in her role at the DOL was instrumental in crafting bills such as the Shepard-Towner Act of 1921. I believe I put that on this slide, yeah, which it basically offers federal funds to states for programs offering maternity and infant care for workers. And then probably the most famous person in this, brief history of the DOL is Frances Perkins. So Perkins is FDR's pick a couple decades later to head the Labor Department. And she's born in 1882, graduated from Mount Holyoke with a degree in social economics. In 1910, she's hired as the secretary of the New York Consumers League, which is a federation of unions and consumer activists. So it's not a labor organization proper. It's sort of a federation that aggregates a bunch of related causes. But she successfully lobbies state legislatures across the country, starting with New York, for a bill limiting the work week for women and children to 54 hours. Doesn't sound great now, but again, this is a largely unregulated economy. So getting children to a max of 54 hours was a big win. She was also very active in the women's suffrage movement. Again, it's hard to overstate Perkins' achievements. She was the principal architect of the Social Security Act. She used her power as secretary to convene national meetings of unions and consumer groups across the country to promote the establishment of minimum wages at the state and federal level. And that work eventually culminates, not immediately, but by 1938, in the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is sort of the centerpiece of employment law to this day, which establishes the minimum wage and the 8-hour day. Okay. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB. But first, I'll give you a little bit of overview. So the government before the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 generally doesn't involve itself formally in labor management relations. So there's no government agency that is tasked with arbitrating disputes, sanctioning elections, no guidelines for what constitutes illegal anti-union behavior. You can fire someone for trying to start a union. But I should say, they're still not legal within the bounds of, of civil and criminal law to smack someone for, joining a union. You're still covered by basic protections of federal, civil, criminal, and constitutional law. It's not illegal to fire someone on that basis, right? And yes, there was a lot of violence against union organizers at this time. So before the NLRB, we do have some sort of proto agencies like the War Labor Board in 1819. So this didn't have enforcement powers. The labor and management basically during the war agreed to refrain from strikes or lockouts as a result of the mediating efforts of this board. It was basically like a mediation board. And they recognize the right to organize in trade unions and bargain collectively, but only in specific sectors affecting the war economy. And then Railway Labor Act formally establishes a structure to organize unions and bargain collectively, but only in the rail industry. So again, no real equivalent to the NLRB yet. We have this mediator in the War Labor Board in the First World War, and then we have this Railway Labor Act just for the railroad industry. And then we have the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which curbed the power of the courts to issue injunctions or restraining orders against striking workers, unless there was violence or fraud. But it doesn't rise to the level of a full-fledged labor law. Then by 1935, we get the National Labor Relations Act, and that's what creates the NLRB. And the NLRB had, you know, I can talk about it later. Maybe we have people who work for the NLRB on the call, but it establishes a formal structure for recognizing the right of workers to engage in concerted activity, join unions, stipulates a bunch of conditions under which it is illegal to fire someone for joining a union. If you're in a union that has been recognized by NLRB, then your employer has to bargain with you collectively in good faith. Like, we can talk more about that later, what that means. And I think it's important to recognize that the NLRB when it started in 35 is sort of attracts people from the labor movement. It's sort of historical accounts portrayed as sort of an agency of reformers, right? So early interviews with agency officials give you the sense that it's staffed by very optimistic and energetic people with really earnest intentions of aiding the agency and balancing the power between employers and employees. There is a Nixon era turn, as there was for a lot of things. You know, the big like sort of turning point is the appointment of Edward Miller, who was sort of the first management side employer, someone who spent his career representing employers in suits against unions or defending against unions. And then Reagan's board sort of upends this partisan balance norm. So it had been the norm of the agency at the top. You have this board of 5 people. They're the kind of the Supreme Court of the National Labor Relations Board, and they determine you know, these sort of quasi judiciary decisions, you know, about sort of illegal firings or, you know, disputes regarding an election. And it had been the norm in this department, not the law, a norm, that the president would appoint 3 people from his party and 2 people from the other party. But Reagan sort of starts to upend this norm by leaving vacancies, all right? And so, for instance, for over half of Reagan's first term, only 1 Democrat served on the board. And for a period of about 18 months, there were no Democrats at all. And while subsequent administrations would, for the most part, return to the norm of 3 partisan appointments, the Trump administration was notable for placing 1 or fewer Democrats on the board for over half his term. A big figure in sort of the turn of the NLRB in these years is Chairman Donald Dodson. I won't have time to talk a lot about Dodson, but I can talk about him in the Q&A if you're interested in. But he was the first really ideological, openly ideological appointee at the NLRB, and someone who really wanted to undermine its operations, and is on record saying that. Clinton board is also notable because while the board at the highest level was meant to be an impartial board and people were drawn largely from academia, former government service jobs, this turn towards appointing management appointees elicits a delayed response from the labor. And finally, the Clinton board appoints the first union side appointee in 1994. So I'll say a little bit more about this in a second. So in political science, we've studied politicization of bureaucracies a lot. I don't think I've ever given a talk about politicization of bureaucracies to people who work for bureaucracies. So this is interesting. But we do study this. You know, one of the classic ways of studying this is sort of looking at shares of bureaucracies that are directly under presidential control. So PAS appointees, presidentially appointed, and Senate confirmed appointees. We can also look at things like response time of requests from Congress. So do bureaucracies respond more quickly to Congress members who share the party of the president, right? And so we can measure that quantitatively. We know from a lot of research that politicians with business backgrounds have more conservative voting behavior, receive more PAC money, and are less supportive of just redistribution. And we can sort of extend this notion to bureaucrats too. And I want to say, note that these backgrounds explain more than what can be accounted for by partisanship. So what I'm going to do in the next slide is show you some data from, on NLRB appointees and their sort of politicization. NLRB appointees are drawn broadly from government, academia, and law. And the lawyers who have come to dominate the agency skew liberal. Lawyers in general skew liberal, but there's wide variation across fields. So how they skew in a particular agency or a particular industry, that there's considerable variation there. But we know in aggregate, lawyers do skew liberal. One interesting feature of the NLRB is that in labor law, there's really only two types of firms. You're either a union side firm or a management side firm, and there's no overlap between the two. So we can glean a lot about somebody's ideology from whether they've come from a firm that represents unions or represents management side. So quick snapshot of study one. I created a database of employment backgrounds of all NLRB appointees at the high level, going back to 1935. And what I'm trying to do is identify evolutions in the proportion of the board members and councils with experience in management side labor relations or union busting law firms or union side firms, right? And I've done this for the Department of Labor as well and some other agencies. It's important because there's been a rise of a very sophisticated cottage industry that specializes in busting unions. And there's been certain administrations have been drawing their appointees from these firms. And then I'm going to show you another, related study where I sort of connect this data set to board member decisions on unfair labor practices that go up to the full board, the sort of Supreme Court at the National Labor Relations Board. Okay, so what did I do to make this data set? So I used a wide range of archival sources to collect basically the biographies of these people, going back to mid-19th century documents for those who were born early. So I'm using things like confirmation hearings, old newspaper articles from the 19th and 20th centuries to find out where people went to high school, where they went to college, what they did afterwards. I'm using proprietary databases, legal databases, some just publicly available things like LinkedIn profiles for the more recent appointees. And I pieced together, using over 2,000 documents, the complete employment histories of the Senate confirmed appointees who've served at the agency since 1935. The next slide is going to be a little overwhelming, but I think it's a good way of representing the data. Can you guys see that? Okay, all right. So what I've done here is I've represented this data visually. These are the backgrounds of the appointees at the NLRB since 1935. The board was smaller before Taft-Hartley, so it was only 3 people and a general counsel. It goes up to 5 in a general counsel after 1947, so that's why you see the bars change height there. The key that's right in the top left tells you what the background is of each appointee. So the first thing I'll note is most people are coming from what I'm calling sort of neutral backgrounds, prior government service, academia. You have some people coming from corporate backgrounds, but the management backgrounds these are people who come from like specifically jobs where relating to negotiating for employers with unions, so representing employers. You have some people coming from these management jobs in the mid-century, but it doesn't really take off until Nixon, and then really full force during Reagan and H.W. Bush. Another thing that happens is we have it's always natural to have some days of vacancies. So the gray bars are vacancies. So this is a weighted average over each year. So, you're going to have a few days at least of vacancies in between appointments. Sometimes someone resigns unexpectedly. But if you can see, there's really a cleavage between at the middle of this graph where, you have maybe a month at most or something of people of having a vacancy to sometimes half of a year, half the board is vacant in the late 20th century and early 21st century. A lot of this is strategic. They're trying to avoid press about manipulating the partisan balance of the board by just sort of leaving it vacant. So, you're a Democratic president, you can do something like when the Republicans resign or their chairmen, you just don't reappoint them, and all of a sudden you have a fully Democratic board. So the other thing to note is that you get a lot of union side appointees starting in the 90s. So sort of a delayed response to this management side appointee phenomenon. Quick summary of a related study. So what impact do these backgrounds have on unfair labor practice decisions? So these are decisions on the legal or illegal firings of workers on the basis of being a union member. And so I'm using Section 8A3, which is the section of the Act that governs this. And I'm looking at conflictual moments because this is where we can get variation. A lot like the Supreme Court, where over 90% of Supreme Court decisions in many terms are unanimous. There are only a few, there's a subset of things for which there's actually contention, right? So the law tends to be pretty clear on most things. So you got to look at the dissents. And I've identified 1,844 decisions with dissents. And then I'm coding all the votes on those dissents. And I get 5,372 vote member pairs. So enough data to sort of make some conclusions. And I'm fitting a logit model to this where I'm basically looking at probability of a vote for the union side in a dispute, and that's 1, or the business's side, so against a violation, that's 0. And then I create this employment ideology scale, where 1 is going to be management side, 0 is going to be a union side, and 0.5 is going to be somewhere in between. And then 1 is going to be Republican and 0 is going to be Democrat for the party variable. And so I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but the top line is what you might expect. This is among Republicans, the probability of voting for at least just 1 violation in a case is a bit above 60%. But if you are a management side Republican, your probability goes down to about 43%. So pretty substantial difference here. Same thing for unions among Democrats. So if we subset to Democrats, we see that the probability of siding with the union is about 80%, and that skyrockets to well over 95% if you come from a union background. Okay, final slides I have are some more snapshots of some research projects here. I won't be able to go into all the design, but I want to mention that the National Labor Relations Act did exclude a lot of people. There are early exclusions written into the act. So for instance, agricultural workers are not allowed, and still not allowed, to form unions recognized under the act. Home care workers are not, and still not. Independent contractors cannot. Healthcare workers, although they were incorporated in 1974. For the first 30 years, they did not have the right to unionize. Now, there's a lot of debate in political science and in economics about whether this came down to racial and gender animus, because these were mostly very racialized and gendered professions, right? Most nurses were women, for instance. Not most, but a lot of agricultural workers, particularly in the South, were Black. There's sort of a revival in this research that I'm involved in where we're sort of trying to ascertain how much of this came down to racial and gender animus and how much was just sort of simple rational capitalist incentives to like target easy industries for to be able to just have cheaper labor. It seems like the new evidence is suggesting that it's mostly a rational capitalist incentive, and it's easier to target marginalized workers, and it's not pure racial and gender animus. But either way, Southern congressmen are pivotal, and remember, Democrats control a lot of these Southern seats. So Democrats are key in this period at sort of fighting for these exclusions to get to exclude these workers. So again, why haven't farm workers, for instance, just to take one example, been reorganized into the act? I think they're easy targets for marginalization. So let's look at some data from another paper I've written. So there's a lot here. This is the first column is the year by decade. The second column I just want to direct you to is the total number of farm workers in the United States. So these are permanent resident farm workers, not including migrant workers. Disenfranchised is a percentage of how many of those people cannot vote. Now, because so many people were Black folks in the South at the time, these people, de facto had no voting rights. Voting rates in the South for Black people were around 2%. So you de facto have a lot of disenfranchised workers in the South in the first few decades. And we've kind of returned to that era of a lot of disenfranchised farm workers because now a lot of our farm workers come from Central America. We had a lot of non-citizens, obviously, before, but a skyrocketing number now. So the point of this slide is there's so many dynamics here that make them sort of an easy target, and it's really hard for these workers to advocate on their behalf. And I think that explains why they haven't been reorganized into the act. Here's another slide from a related paper where I look at non-resident farm workers by congressional district, to see the concentrations and whether they tend to reside in Republican-controlled districts, Democratic districts, a lot of concentration in Republican districts, actually. But they have no voting rights. So even though we would expect them to probably support Democratic candidates, or at least pro-labor candidates, a lot of these workers are concentrated in red districts. Even though you see a lot of dark red on the map in California, remember those are the more conservative districts in California. And then final sort of snapshot of the research on this is about sort of unions and politics more broadly. So there's a lot of research showing that unions sort of are effective at aggregating and promoting interests of the working class, especially in congressional battles. In high union states, you find this relationship between high inequality and more support for welfare spending. But in low union states, you don't see that rational link between high inequality and support for welfare spending. And then some panel studies have suggested that labor union membership causes lower racial resentment among whites and support for policies that benefit the Black community. So we do a lot of research on sort of the union effects in political science, and this is just to give you a taste of what that looks like. The last study I'll show you is this one where I do a lot of behavioral experiments where I provide people with policies. I see how they respond. I randomize people into conditions. And, this is a within subjects design where I'm giving people this, you might recall the California independent contractor status referendum, the Uber status referendum, basically whether we can, this hinged on whether we would classify Uber drivers as employees or not. If they're employees, they get a bunch of, state recognized and federally recognized benefits. And so what I do is I take, for instance, Democrats, I expose them to this law, not people in California because they've already been treated, but people in other states that haven't been treated. I ask them, hey, do you support this legislation or do you not? And then I give them a queue. I randomize them into these queues, and I tell them, okay, I don't give them any information about the legislation. I just tell them, hey, the following organizations, among others, have come out against this legislation. And among Democrats, if you give them a simple queue, you have a steep decline in the number of people who support the legislation. In other words, a queue for unions to oppose it actually is effective at getting Democrats to oppose it. So they sort of see unions aligned with sort of the progressive position, which is a good sign for sort of those of us who are invested in rational political behavior. And I have similar findings on Republicans, that are aligned to their ideology and rational interests. So this is just a snapshot of the kinds of things I do, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But I think I am out of time, so I'll just say thank you very much. I look very much forward to your questions.